My name is Peter Galadza. I'm a Ukrainian Catholic priest and the acting director of the Metropolitan CHESTERTON'S Institute of Eastern Christian Studies here at this university. Yes, thank you very much, Father. I really, that's so kind. I'll repay the favor. Before we begin, I have to admit that having grown up with the tradition that a 7 o'clock talk begins at 7:15, I feel that we're actually kind of being super punctual because it's actually only 7:05, and with the weather being as it is, some people may be coming in late. But if you could just give me 2-3 minutes, not just to introduce Father Bob, but also for us to pray. We're going to pray before the lecture tonight, but also just to share with you one or two comments about the beautiful connection between the Sheptytsky Institute and Madonna House, and the beautiful connection between Catherine de Hewitt Doherty and Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, the patron of the Sheptytsky Institute. How many of you know that Catherine de Hewitt Doherty met Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky? Okay, not too many. All right, this is very good. I feel like there's some point in talking. How many of you know in what year they met? Yes, Father Michael.
The 1930s.
It was the 30s. Very good. Okay, you're there. You got a B plus now. Anybody want the A or the A plus? Let's get a little bit closer. 1930s. It was actually Catherine de Hewitt Doherty was able to get out of Europe just in time to avoid the war. So what would that have been?
1945.
Okay, 39. Okay, she's there in August of 39 doing articles. In this case, it was an article that she sent to Commonweal. And it's a very moving piece. I'm almost moved to tears because she says, I showed up at the Metropolitan's Palace. I mean, this was a thing built back in the 1700s, so it had all those Baroque Habsburg qualities to it. And she said, yeah, when I walked into this palace, I couldn't rid myself of the sense that I was somewhere in the kind of environment that would have been influenced by St. Francis of Assisi, the little poor one. And after looking around at the very, very drab environment, the living quarters of Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, even though it was a palace, I asked, this is Catherine de Hewitt Doherty, I asked an elderly lady who was sitting there in the waiting room with me, why is everything just so drab, so poor here? And she said, well, don't you know, the Metropolitan spends nothing on his own needs, on his own comfort. Everything goes to his many charities, to the poor people that he cares for. So I suggest to you that you Google, you might be able to find that article. I mean, Commonweal, I think, has archives. And if you Catherine de Hewitt Doherty, Sheptytsky, Commonweal, 1939, and in general, the article that Catherine de Hewitt Doherty wrote about Metropolitan Andrei is a very, very moving piece. And our connection with Madonna House, it's a real honor, Father, to have you here again. Basically, I just told Father, anytime you want to talk here, just give us a call. Well, we're very honored to have you because for us, for our young people at the Sheptytsky Institute, Madonna House represents real Christianity. We don't know how blessed we are here in Ontario, in Western Quebec, that we have this kind of community because it combines solid orthodoxy, true Catholicism, with something that sometimes gets lost, in the midst of some of our other concerns with regards to authentic Catholicism, and that is this radical evangelical gospel lifestyle. This real commitment to living the poor lifestyle, to be with the poor, to engage in the kind of asceticism that doesn't allow one to become lax, to become all too self-satisfied in one's approach to life. And forces one to rely on the Lord constantly. So we're going to begin with a prayer, and I'm going to ask all of you to rise. We'll sing the traditional prayer to the Holy Spirit, Heavenly King. And I ask you at this time to also remember in a special way the people of Ukraine and all the people who formed the Soviet Union, and Catherine Doherty, who was born in Russia. This is a woman of Russian background who knew that reality so well. We ask that she intercede so that the leaders of the Kremlin might be enlightened in their policies and might cease the aggression that they have unleashed on Ukraine, and that everyone, whether they're in Kiev or Moscow or wherever, might have the desire for peace first and foremost in their hearts. Heavenly King, and the Spirit of truth, who are everywhere present and fill all things, treasury of blessings bestower of life, come and dwell within us, cleanse us of all that defiles us, and your good one save our souls. Lord God, we ask you to bless us this evening, to bless our presenter, Father Robert. Give him your wisdom, enable us to hear the proclamation of the truth that he will be sharing with us. Enable us to trample underfoot all the wiles of the evil one. Enable us to be victorious over all his lies. Let all diabolical powers be vanquished during this entire evening and during all our lives. For you, O Lord, are the source of all truth. You are the one who conquered death itself, and we send up glory to you together with your Father, who is without beginning, and your all-holy, good, and life-giving Spirit, now and forever and ever. Amen. Please be seated. So when I asked Father Bob Weil to give me a little bio of himself, he told me, well, I was born at a very early age. I don't know, is that not common in Buffalo, New York? Hey, Father hails from Buffalo. The best thing about Buffalo is it's across the river from Canada. I actually almost said it's across the river from Welland, Ontario. That was my first exposure to Buffalo. And he did his seminary in Buffalo. As you probably know, he's been the editor of several of Catherine's works and written a couple of books of his own. He, of course, is also the postulator for the cause of beatification of Catherine de Hewitt Doherty. Among his books, in addition to this marvelous, I always judge a book by its cover, so I haven't read it, but it really looks marvelous to me. But we know that Father Bob is a marvelous author, and so in addition to this book about Chesterton and his confrontation with the devil, exposing the lies of the devil, etc. He's got another book. The first one actually that he wrote on Chesterton is entitled "The Tumbler of God: Chesterton as Mystic," which I have started to read. I've gotten about halfway through. It's really good. Don't do what I do, which is only read half the book sometimes. Go to the end. I certainly plan to, because it's a fascinating thesis. He points out, Father Bob points out that many people frequently just, they know all sorts of aspects of Chesterton's thought in his life, but they don't perceive of him as a mystic. And Father Bob is a great case of pointing out the ways in which there is a mysticism that really grounds a lot of his thinking. So I want to say that I think it's extremely appropriate, not only in our day and age, but certainly during this time of Lent, to have what I consider to be almost a kind of mini retreat. I mean, anytime Father Bob speaks, it's a very, very profound sharing that takes place from the depth of his heart. And so in addition to the amazing intelligence that he comes to every lecture with. There's also that depth which makes this not just a fantastic lecture, and I can assure you it will be a fantastic lecture, but something that will beautifully and very helpfully guide us to the very end of Lent. So without further ado, please welcome Father Bob Wild speaking on Chesterton, Jousting with the Devil, Chesterton's battle with the Father of Lies.
Well, thanks, Father Peter, for those words about Banana House and myself. It's just how I wrote them. We really all look quite heroic to come out on a Sunday night to hear about the devil. Just think of the things you could be doing. Watching television or something.
Encountering the devil.
I don't know how much individually you know about Chesterton. I presume that you're here because you know something about him. And I'm very glad that you were able to come this evening. We're going to be talking about the devil, but I'd like to introduce my talk by saying that there's a lot more angels than devils. It's to keep the dark side of the world in perspective. Like right now, I believe there's a couple hundred angels here. I don't know if there's any devils or not, but it's always to keep in perspective the dark side. Chesterton himself believed there was much more goodness in the world. It's kind of a background of white, and then there's the dark side. And he said once about the news that we have the expression, the exception proves the rule. He said what you have in the news is all the exceptions. It's like if a bank is robbed, it makes the news, but actually that day most banks were not robbed. And you can apply that to almost anything that's a murder here, and whatever happens there. So he always wanted to emphasize that the goodness of the world predominates, and that was one thing he tried to get across in his teachings. You know, people talk about the problem of evil, but there's no problem of goodness. Do you ever think people don't wonder about the problem of goodness because it's always present, always the predominant part of our lives. You probably know that Pope Francis, probably more than any other modern pope, talks about the devil. Without exaggeration, maybe once a week or several times a month. In fact, in his sermon for last Sunday, he talked specifically about the meaning of this time in Lent. He said it's a time of combat, a spiritual combat against the spirit of evil. And I begin with that because it was a principal theme, as I hope to share with you tonight. It was a principal theme in Chesterton's writings. He was always battling something. And if you know something of his writing, his poetry and his novels and his editorials, he believed that life was a battle. And the devil was one of the combatants, not the only one. But it's something that appears quite frequently in his writings. And he was very clear on what the battle was about. Here's a quote from him. "It is the whole strange story of the treason of the archangel. of his betrayal of a divine plan, of his relative success, but his ultimate failure. So he was very clear. St. Paul says it's not simply a battle of flesh and blood, but it is a battle as well, not only against evil spirits, but that also is part of our Catholic understanding. And the things that Chesterton predicted in the 20s and 30s and 40s, they're happening now in the world of sexuality and family. You can find predictions of most of the things happening today in his early writings, especially his editorials in the London Illustrated News. And so in his writings, he predicted many major ways that Satan tempts us. And we are witnessing today, you might say, the devil blowing his cover, coming out in very exotic and obvious ways. And so a part of Chesterton's importance then is his combat, as he understood it, with evil spirits. The Anglican Church in England has just taken out of their baptismal formula the renunciation of the devil. So my book could become quite popular in England among the remnant, one of their very own. I want to emphasize also that in Chesterton's studies, there hasn't been a lot about his combat with the evil spirits, even in some works about the theology of his teaching, or there hasn't been a great deal, even in two great biographies, there's no mention at all about this theme, which I call more than a theme. So I felt there was something lacking as well in Chesterton's studies that hadn't been addressed. In one of his visits to the United States, he came here several times. One time was during Prohibition. He said he had to escape into Canada to get a drink. But he was interviewed in Los Angeles, and the interviewer asked him, "Mr. Chesterton, I see you had just written a book, What is Wrong with the World?" He said, "I haven't read the book yet, but could you tell me in a few words, what is wrong with the world?" He said, "The devil." And on another occasion, when somebody in a letter asked him the same question, what's wrong with the world, he said, "I am." That was probably a more accurate answer. The subtitle of my book, the title is Jousting with the Devil, but the subtitle is Chesterton's Battle with the Father of Lies, to be specific about the kind of battle he saw himself engaged in. Satan attacks us in many ways. We could list many ways that we're attacked by Satan. But I will concentrate this evening on his insinuating lies into our minds. And again, not all lies are from Satan, but we have the story of the garden. We have the temptation of the Lord in the desert, insinuating falsehoods into our minds. And so Chesterton's battle was concentrated on the devil's fostering falsehoods of all shapes and sizes. And that was how he understood the battle. In my book, I called Chesterton the St. Anthony of Beaconsfield. That was the town that he lived in. And he started a play on St. Anthony. Unfortunately, he never finished it. But I take St. Anthony and I call Chesterton the St. Anthony of Beaconsfield. And the cover is Chesterton in the cave fighting the bad guys. This cover was done by a friend of mine. It's an original drawing of his. And so one of the particular gifts of St. Anthony, but also the mothers and fathers of the desert, was that they understood that you can't really sin without a thought. I mean, you have to have some understanding of what you're doing. You can't simply have a thought. So they developed a whole technique of discovering what they call the logismoi in Greek thoughts to guard your mind of what you're thinking about. Because if you start thinking in the wrong way, you might be led to the wrong kind of actions. And as I said, not all bad thoughts come from the bad guys. We can do a lot on our own, but some of them certainly do. And so, at the heart of Chesterton's fighting spirit was uncovering falsehoods in the modern mind, because bad ideas lead to bad actions, and to discover the enemy's position of false ideas from which he launches his attacks. You may or may not be familiar with Walter de la Mare's poem that Chesterton's wife chose for the funeral card for Chesterton. And I want to quote it here because it serves as a very important proof of how his wife and other people, and de la Mare, who wrote this poem, how they understood Chesterton's battle. And here's what was on the card. Knight of the Holy Ghost, wisdom his motley, his clothing, truth his loving jest. And then this line here, the mills of Satan keep his lance at play. The mills of Satan keep his lance at play. Pity and innocence his heart at rest. So they understood very well that Chesterton was not just fighting against the human wrong ideas or wrong philosophies, but that he also was very much aware of the influence of Satan in our minds. And one of his press colleagues, Titterton, his name was, he wrote to this person, he wrote, "This is God's universe, all right, but there is the enemy." When I was working on this book, I came across a reference to a book called Chesterton and Evil by Mark Knight. I think he lives in England, I'm not sure. But when I read that advertisement, I thought to myself, oh no, somebody's already written a book about Chesterton and the devil. But again, to show how this has been neglected, there's hardly anything at all in this book about the devil. The whole book was Chesterton and Evil. And so he writes about some of the philosophical positions, the privatio boni, etc. But he doesn't touch it all, except in this one paragraph I'm going to quote you. It's the only time in the whole book he adverts to the devil. Here's a quote from this book. Chesterton's desire to avoid theological dualism left him in a similar quandary to Aquinas. How much and what sort of a role to assign to the devil? And despite the large number of references, and note that large number of references to the devil that can be found in the Father Brown stories, the references are openly metaphorical rather than literal attempts to account for the evil that transpires. Now, I'm no Father Brown expert, but many of these references are to somebody, I think, with the eyes of faith. They're not metaphorical. They come from Chesterton's Christian Catholic background, his understanding of the faith, and this particular author reads them as metaphorical, but I think most of them are certainly not. Here's his conclusion to the above quoted paragraph I just read you. Quote, "The devil serves little function in Chesterton's explanation of the evil that occurs in the world." So let me repeat that again, because I think my book is a direct refutation of that statement. He said, "The devil serves little function in Chesterton's explanation of the evil that occurs in the world." And I must say, I wondered if the author himself believed in the devil, because there was a great deal of denial about any kind of mention or influence in Chesterton's writing. And so I found his conclusion quite astonishing. So in the Father Brown stories, I suppose some of you have read Father Brown, I hope. Someone said once that if we ever send a space capsule out of space, it should include that book, the Father Brown stories, as part of our culture. But in many ways, the origin of the story comes from a conversation that Chesterton had with Father O'Connor, who later became Father Brown. And it was a conversation about some terrible things that were going on in London, and Chesterton was going to write about them, and Father O'Connor dissuaded him of doing so. And from the context of this conversation, it seems it was something about exorcism or diabolical activity. And Father O'Connor didn't think it was a good idea to be writing about that. And then later on, he and Father O'Connor were at a social, and they were talking with some Cambridge college students about music and art and things. And when Father O'Connor left, these college students said, "It's too bad, he can talk about such beautiful things, but he doesn't know anything about reality." All shut up in his rectory and confessional. And that gave Chesterton the idea of Father Brown, that a simple priest who seems to be naive about everything knows more about the human heart and the heart of the criminal than most other people. And it was from that conversation that he got the so-called inspiration for Father Brown's stories. He said, he talked about the solid Satanism which the priest knew and warred against all his life. So in some ways the existence of Satan was at the origin of the Father Brown stories. I want to speak briefly now about several sources of Chesterton's belief in the devil, and some of which stem from his own experience. So I'll get into that shortly. And I simply surmise that his early belief in the devil stemmed from his reading. He was a voracious reader, and his growing understanding of the human condition and what he knew of Christianity. There's a book of his that was put together after his death called Half Hours in Hades. And he relates an incident in 1890 that makes him 16 years old. And he writes, "I was leaving the casino at Monte Carlo in company with an eminent divine, whose name, for obvious reasons, I suppress. And we were engaged in an interesting discussion on the subject of demons, he contending that they were unnecessary, not to say prejudicial, elements in our civilization, an opinion which, needless to say, I strongly opposed." Now, he was only 16 years old, and my friend Dale Alquist, maybe you see him on EWTN on the Chesterton show, he said he thinks that Chesterton believed in devils before he believed in God. His concept of God was very confused at an early age, but it seems that he really did believe in the bad guys as a youngster. And then he writes, he drew several caricatures of demons in this book. Again, he's only 16 years old. And then at the end he says, "When the young student grows older," talking about himself, "he will meet others, that is, other demons in his own experience." And that's exactly what happened to Chesterton. It happened most dramatically in his dabbling with the planchette and Ouija boards. And he relates this experience in a talk he gave in Miracles in 1914. He's explaining his own experience with the Ouija board and things like that. Quote, "In my boyhood, I worked with the planchette, and though I am perfectly willing to admit that I may have gone mad for the time being, or that there were resources in my subconsciousness I should never have imagined to exist. If anybody tells me that it was either cheating or done by my own will, I will say it is nonsense. The thing ran across the table a good deal longer than this by which I am standing, with a violent pull. There was something undoubtedly behind it, and it was not either of the two people working it. I simply put this in my own personal testimony. And I also came to the conclusion afterwards that it was a bad experiment, and I would not go on with it. That is, I fear that I would not go on with it. So he had, as a youngster, some personal experience of influence of evil spirits. Another college student he met, in a conversation with him, this guy was talking about some very sordid things he was thinking of doing. And he said, and Chesterton said that this comment by him kind of changed his whole mental outlook. The guy said, if I should do that, I should never know the difference between good and evil. And Chesterton called this person the diabolist. That is, it was such a statement that you could do something and you would no longer know the difference between good and evil. But he said this was a turning point in his life. He said, this remark left in my mind forever a certitude upon the objective solidity of sin. The objective solidity of sin. And it's very significant that he didn't call this person the impressionist or the decadent or the skeptic, but he called him the diabolist, that he sensed there was something really evil in such a mindset. Maybe some of you know William Oddie. He's a great writer in England. He has written a very important book on Chesterton called Chesterton and the Romance of Orthodoxy. And it's his opinion that in Chesterton's writings at the time and what he was reading of the writings of the time, he saw something diabolical going on in the culture itself. Another source of his understanding of the evil spirits. Now, I'll just read you, this is Oddie's quote from his book. It is not simply that the end of the period was a period in which men had gone mad. It was a time when they were possessed by a great evil, in which the city of Mansell, that's Bunyan's other great work on the Holy War, his allegory, in which the city of Mansell was besieged by hosts of the devil. And then this sentence here is very significant for Chesterton's intellectual development. He said, Chesterton's orthodoxy begins not simply with the perception of unorthodoxy, of intellectual incoherence or aberration, but with a vision of positive evil. This is the early 20th century. That something evil was going on in the culture. It was another source of his awareness of who he was combating. And he quotes Chesterton, writing in this period, I never, even in this first vague and skeptical age, indulged very much in the current arguments about the relativity of evil or the unreality of sin. Perhaps I was one of the few people in that world of diabolism who really believed in devils. So it's quite extraordinary that somebody, a young man at that time, had this belief when the devils were being rationalized away or psychologized away. Well, it's part of a grace that he had in his own development. It's Oddie's contention that Chesterton saw personal powers of evil at work in the world in which he was growing up. Now, another source of Chesterton's awareness of the dark side was something in his own personal experience. I call it the dark side. In the last few years, there's been a number of authors giving their opinions about this, the dark side, they call it, of Chesterton's character. And in one article in the Chesterton Review, the author says, "I am merely suggesting that there is another side of Chesterton that has become more significant and more salient in recent decades." And I want to quote an excerpt from one of Chesterton's letters to Monsignor Ronald Knox, who was fairly influential in his conversion to the church, not the only influence, but he was a very close friend of the family. But this reveals Chesterton's other side. We think of Chesterton as, very lighthearted and joking all the time, but there is, I believe myself, this other side to him, and this is his own personal testimony about his experience. Writing to Monsignor Knox, "I have as much vanity as anybody about any of these superficial successes." He's talking about his public speaking and debates that he won while they are going on. "But I never feel for a moment that they affect the reality of whether I am utterly rotten or not." Now, nobody would ever say that about Chesterton himself, but he's talking about some of his own experience that he has, so that any public comments on my religious position seem like a wind on the other side of the world, as if they were about somebody else, as indeed they are. And I am concerned about what has become of a little boy whose father showed him a toy theater, and a schoolboy whom nobody ever heard of, with his brooding on doubts and dirt and daydreams, of crude conscientiousness, so inconsistent as to be near hypocrisy. And then this line here, talking about himself and all the morbid life of the lowly, lonely mind of a person with whom I have lived. It is that story that so often came near to ending badly, but I wanted to end well. So he attributes these things to himself, not only an experience of bad things happening in the world, but he said, "What's wrong with the world? I am." And he wasn't joking. In his autobiography, when he speaks about the conclusion of The Man Who Was Thursday, he wrote, "Even in the earliest days, and even for the worst reasons, I already knew too much to pretend to get rid of evil. So I introduced at the end one figure who really does, with the full understanding, deny and defy the good. I put that statement into the story, testifying to the extreme evil, which is merely unpardonable, the unpardonable sin of not wishing to be pardoned. Not because I had learned it from any of a million priests I had never met, but because I had learned it from myself." And for you, those of you who have read the novel, that's really Sunday, the figure at the end that he makes as the to emphasize that part of reality. No doubt somebody has psychoanalyzed Chesterton as to the source of these feelings, or somebody will. But I offer one possible partial explanation as regards the source of these personal estimations. And Father mentioned that one of the books I wrote recently about Chesterton, about his mysticism. And I believe he received a real mystical grace. And basically it was about awareness of the experience of God in the world, and God actually continuing creation all the time. But the point I make is that mystics, you often read that before they have received grace, they're often given some very terrible experience of their own sinfulness. I've often come across that in priests of Avila or other mystics. It's kind of a preparation for the graces they're about to receive. And I believe that Chesterton also received a profound experience of his own sinfulness, the ability that he had to deny God like everybody else. So that's again my interpretation, but I think that is also another source of his understanding of the dark side of the world, that we all possess something of that in ourselves. He was asked once what he thought about hell. He said he thought it's a place to be avoided. And he's never actually been there himself or met anybody who had been there. But would it be possible in such an experience to get a taste of hell? This time of preparation for grace, is it possible to get a taste of what abandonment might be? How many of you have read his play Magic? I suggest that in the context of this talk. It's about, it was fashionable in those times to invite magicians to the parlor and to do tricks for everybody. And so that's what the play is about. But there's one trick, a light across the field that changes color. And at the magician's beckoning. And one of the guys in the party is a skeptic, and he's going crazy because he can't understand how he's doing this trick. And somebody tells him, tell this guy something because he's going crazy. But he decides not to tell him, but somebody else asks him, what did you tell Morris? That's the skeptic. And the magician, that he calls him the conjurer, says, I shall not tell you. And the guy says, why not? And the magician says, because God and the demons and that immortal mystery that you deny has been in this room tonight. Because you know it has been here, because you have felt it here, because you know the spirits as well as I do and fear them as much as I do. And then he has this magician say, I dabbled a little in table wrapping and table turning. Chesterton might be thinking of his own experience. But soon I had reason to give it up. And a woman in the community asked, but why did you give it up? The magician said, it began to give me headaches. It began to give Chesterton headaches too, when he went to these Ouija board things. And I found that every morning after a spiritualist seance, I had a queer feeling of lowness and degradation, of having been soiled. And it wasn't long before the spirits with whom I had been playing at table turning did what I think they generally do at the end of all such table turning. They turned the tables. They turned the tables on me. So my point in the book is that it's very significant that for his first play, and probably the most popular play, it's about the actual presence of evil spirits, that this magician was in cahoots. And it was real magic in the story. And that changing of the light was not done by... And one of the great commentaries on Chesterton, he wrote this: the play is arguing the case for an unfashionable belief in the reality of the power of evil. And Chesterton himself said about this play, quote, all the people in magic are purposely made good so that there shall be no villain except the great invisible villain. Now, it's very significant, I think, that for his first play, that Bernard Shaw kept pushing him to write a play. For his first play, he chose a story that is a proof of the presence of evil spirits sometimes involved in these magical tricks. So I think this is an unambiguous, significant confirmation of how he, Chesterton, understood what his lifelong battle was all about. Perhaps some of you have read his book, The Everlasting Man, about Christ, which was very significant in the life of C.S. Lewis. And in the opening paragraphs of a chapter called Demons and Philosophers, Chesterton gives some very truly penetrating insights as to the influence of devils on civilizations as a whole. If you ever come across that book. And one of his insights that should give us more than pause, is that communication with them is a phenomenon which occurs not for the most part in so-called primitive stages of civilization, but rather in its developed stages. And this is a quote from that book. All over the world, the traces can be found of this striking and solid fact, so curiously overlooked by the moderns who speak of all such evil as primitive and early in evolution. And that, as a matter of fact, some of the very highest civilizations of the world were the very places where the horns of Satan were exalted, not only to the stars, but in the face of the sun. And so this chapter in The Everlasting Man, I recommend to you, it's probably the most extensive and penetrating treatment of the influence of demons upon civilizations as a whole. You might find it very important for our own times. And in this book, The Everlasting Man, is one of the best books you could read about Christ. Chesterton wrote it for people who had never heard of Christ. Kind of hard, because we've read so much, heard so much, it's hard to read the Gospels kind of for the first time. But he tried to write it as if the reader had never heard anything about Christ. And the devil, he says, is at the center of Christ's understanding of his mission in battle. So this is one of my favorite quotes from Chesterton. Many people point to Christ as a great poet, or a prophet, or a moralist. In many ways, he is very much alive to modern people. But if anyone really set off to discover Christ, that is, read the gospel as if for the first time, with unprejudiced eyes, what would she or he discover? It is that the exorcist towers above the poet and even the prophet. That the story between Cana and Calvary is one long war with demons. He understood better than 100 poets the beauty of the flowers of the battlefield, but he came out to do battle. And if most of his words mean anything at all, they do mean that there is at our very feet, like a chasm concealed among the flowers, an unfathomable evil. Pretty strong words. Again, Chesterton, the language of the gospel seems to me to go much more singly to a single issue. The voice that is heard there has such authority as speaks to any army, and the highest note of it is victory rather than peace. And when the disciples were first sent forth with their faces to the four corners of the earth, and turned again to acclaim their master, he did not say in that hour of triumph, these are some of my favorite lines, he did not say to them, all are aspects of one harmonious whole. And they came back from there. Or, all things find their end in nirvana. Or, the dewdrop slips into the shining sea. He looked up and said, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. That's what he saw as a result of their teaching. We're going to talk a little bit about the novel The Ball and the Cross, and I'd like to emphasize that this is probably Chesterton's most sustained treatment of temptations of the evil spirit. I mentioned that William Audi referred to Bunyan's second allegory, the Holy War. And in that book, there's often council sessions of the bad guys talking about how they're going to conduct their war. And when I read that, I haven't read the whole novel, but I did it for research. It reminded me something of the Screwtape Letters, and I often wondered if C.S. Lewis got any of his inspiration from these caricatures that were in this novel. For example, this is one of the discussions the bad guys have. They're trying to overcome the city of Mansoul that has been taken from them. And they say, let us assault them in all pretended fairness, covering our intentions with all manner of lies, flatteries, delusive words, feigning things that will never be, and promising them that which they shall never find. What we promise them will, in the end, believe us, especially if in all our lies and feigned words we pretend great love to them, and that our design is only their advantage and honor. So this is kind of a satanic temptations. And so Adi conjectures that Mansoul was one of Chesterton's muses in his understanding of his battle, the battle with Satan. So in the Ball of the Cross, there's these two guys, one is an atheist and one is a fervent Catholic. And they believe so much in their convictions that they want to fight a duel. But people are against them, mostly because they think there's no such thing as truth, and so there's no sense in fighting any duels. And one of the characters in Ball on the Cross is called Professor Lucifer, obviously who it is. But on page after page in this novel, Professor Lucifer is giving out false ideas about the church, about Christ, about truth. And it's just filled with, I think, Chesterton's understanding of how in some ways, Satan can tempt us. So this understanding of Satan was always in Chesterton's mind, background. And Adi says, a nightmare which fades with the light of day, but which is never finally forgotten. Chesterton is always aware of this kind of battle that is not simply against human ideologies, but is something on a much spiritual level. Perhaps some of you are aware of Robert Hugh Benson's Lord of the World, written around the same time, and also Solovyev's Antichrist, Story of the Antichrist. And in some ways, Chesterton's Ball on the Cross, it's not as apocalyptic as these two novels, but it was the turn of the century, just like the turn of for us, the year 2000, all kind of apocalyptic genres coming out. So Chesterton's Ball on the Cross is kind of it's part of an apocalyptic genre. It's not about the end of the world, but Chesterton says it's about the end of something. So, but I think it's in the same genre as Benson's novel, The Lord of the World. Benson knew about Chesterton. He had read some of his writings, so there's some relationship there. At the end of Chesterton's book, the New Jerusalem, we have a summing up in a way of this aspect of Chesterton's life and writings, and what I think is a succinct statement of the thesis of my book. And in a very few paragraphs, Chesterton is talking about the mind, fairy tales, theology, drama, all areas to which he applied his great mind. But if battle is an all-pervasive theme in his writings, in his own mind, it is a battle also with this unfathomable evil at our very feet. And here he relates this theme to all four areas that I mentioned. For example, the area of the mind. This is all kind of in a half paragraph, half a page. In the realm of the mind. In all our brains, certainly in mine, were buried things as bad as any buried under that bitter sea. He's talking about the pigs that were cast into the sea in the Matthew's Gospel. And if he did not come to do battle with them, even in the darkness of the brain of man, I know not why he came. Certainly, it was not only to talk about flowers and socialism. That's not why he came. And in the area of fairy tales, some of which he has written himself, he says, the more truly we can see life as a fairy tale, the more clearly the tale resolves itself into war with the dragon that is wasting fairyland. Maybe at the heart of many fairy tales. And in theology, I remember distinguished men among liberal theologians who found it more difficult to believe in one than in many. They admitted in the New Testament an attestation to evil spirits, but not to a general enemy of mankind. And then in the field of drama, as some are said to want the drama of Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark, they would have the drama of hell without the Prince of Darkness. And so a very important aspect of Chesterton's prophetic and apologetic mission, by the way, is being considered, I think myself, one of the great apologists of certainly the 20th century. He's drawn thousands of people into the church because he had to work through in his own mind what he called the tangles of the mind to the faith. And so he understands the journey that people have to take. So he's one of the great apologists, and part of his mission was keeping alive, if we can put it that way, in the reality of the evil spirits, which is part of our faith. Well, not the most cheery part of his legacy. It is an essential dimension of the truth of the gospel. And it is a testimony to his greatness that he did not shirk from the most difficult truths of the Christian faith. You probably know that there's a possibility of a cause for canonization starting in England. It hasn't started yet, but someone has been appointed to look into the possibility. And when it gets underway, as I'm sure it will, the church will pay particular attention not so much to his theory of distributism or his literary criticism, as to his understanding of the faith. And that's why I think my book on his mysticism will be helpful in that regard too. Our belief in Satan forms part of that faith understanding. And the fact that Chesterton's battle with Satan was an essential part of his life's work will only deepen the church's conviction that he was indeed a defender of the faith, which he was called before or after his death. I'd like to conclude that if Chesterton was fighting against Satan, I think the devil was fighting against Chesterton as well. Because anybody with that kind of intellectual ability to convince people to the Catholic faith, they have to certainly be an object of his attacks. And as one of the great apologists of our time, perhaps of all time, I think the bad guys were warring against him as well. It's significant that even though Chesterton is considered one of the great writers of the 20th century, there's very little in academia about his study and his writings. Maybe he's too Catholic for most universities. But I think the devil would rather they study Nietzsche or anybody else but people like Chesterton, because it might attract people to something like the Catholic faith. They might sneak into the library and read one of his books. So keep that in your prayers as well, but it's not only it's not only Chesterton fighting them, but I think they very much would not like to have him very prominent. But there is a mini renewal going on among in the world about Chesterton. And one of the very great things about him was that even though he was consciously fighting what he called this unfathomable evil at our feet, consciously fighting, he was also one of the most joyful men who ever lived. That he was able to keep that perspective in his life. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Father. As always, a very enlightening, very sincere, very profound presentation. We have at least 15-20 minutes for questions, so if you could just speak up. You don't have to identify yourself, but I know there are questions out there. You don't pose any, I will. You don't want me talking again. Somebody is pointing to the person in front of them. Oh, that's right. Do you know that you're being volunteered to pose a question?
Front row.
There's someone in the front row that wants to pose a question? Yes, please.
Well, I will pose a question. I will be the first.
Please do.
Well, I'm intrigued about the title of your book. Why jousting? The connotations of medieval tournament, knight errants, lances. Well, why jousting?
Well, isn't that kind of another word for battling, jousting with someone? Well, it's an image of his battling with Satan. Like, that's what the title means to me. Is jousting another word for fighting with somebody?
But he's wondering whether the medieval, the tournament dimension, because jousting, as the gentleman mentioned, is
Chesterton was very much medieval minded, and it's an image. Like it comes from the prayer card at his funeral that I quoted too. They use that word, so I think that's where I basically got the idea from. His funeral card, Delamar's poem, jousting with.
Thank you.
When did he live and when did he die?
He was born in.
Well, do you want to stand at the mic?
Sure.
Unless you want to sit down.
No, that's okay. He was born in 1876. He died in 1936. He joined the church in 32. He would have joined earlier, but his wife Frances was not ready. But she joined 4 years later. But he was already a Catholic when he wrote Orthodoxy, in 1910 or so.
Thank you.
Probably overworked himself. Like he didn't take care of himself. Some of the arguments against his canonization, he loved cigars and eating, and he didn't take care of himself, But so I call him a different kind of saint. The essence of sanctity is love, and he loved greatly. I think he was a very loving man, and one of his virtues was keeping friendship with people he violently disagreed with. Like with Wells and Shaw. They probably didn't agree about anything, but they were friends. And Wells said once that he was asked, when you die, what are you going to say to God? He said, well, I'll say I'm a friend of Chesterton. And he thought that was good news. That's quite a compliment, really. But they say Chesterton didn't have any enemies because he respected the person. And he could argue with you all day and then go out and have a beer with you. And He said everything is wrong with Bernard Shaw except himself. Now that's very profound. That is, he respected him as a person, but he disagreed with everything he thought, you know. Everything is wrong with Shaw except himself. But that was that's a great gift to charity to be able to do that, not to take things personally. And Chesterton had that gift. He could really disagree with you and still love you, you know. He said, Jesus said we should love our friends and we should love our enemies and you know, love one another. He said often they're the same person. You know, no, you want to get that right. Love your enemies and love your friends because often they're the same person. Yes.
Neighbor, isn't it?
Heard?
Love our neighbor.
Yes, okay, love your neighbor because often and your enemies because often they're the same person. Thank you. So I think he was he was very charitable, and I think that's what the church looks for, basically. Not so much your asceticism. But I think he will be. Yes, huh?
I have a comment. I wish Chesterton were alive today with all the militant atheism, you know, Dawkins and Hitchens, you know, God is not great and the God delusion. Is there any, I wish you were alive today.
Well, that's why, you know.
Like with all this militant atheism, you know,
That's
Dawkins, Hitchens, Dennett, yeah.
That's why the Chesterton
Sam Harris.
Society in America is trying to keep alive his writings, and he foresaw all these things that are happening. Like I said at the beginning of my talk, he foresaw almost everything that's going on today. He saw the seeds were already in the early part of the 20th century. You know, so very, very prophetic in that sense. So that's why, if he was alive, we can keep his writings alive, and that's what we're trying to do: is keep his writings alive. You know, so I hope you become more interested in reading him, and it's very powerful. Yes,
For him personally, were there things that were very important to him for equipping himself?
I don't think I can hear my ears a little bit.
Okay, for him personally, is there anything he would say that was very important for him for equipping himself for jousting against the devil, like in his daily life?
Well, I think as I said at the beginning, he saw it mostly as guarding your mind. You know, of this technique that the desert mothers and fathers had. So he would say, I think, really pay special attention to your thoughts, because bad thoughts lead to bad actions. So I think for him that was the great protection. I think he certainly didn't do much fasting.
Oh yeah.
But he would say, guard your mind. Watch what you think. And today, you know, with all the inundation of words and that, there's a lot of information, but there's very little wisdom. So we have a lot of stuff going through our minds, but not much wisdom there. So I would say, he would say, guard your mind, basically. Yes?
Can you tell us about the G.K. Chesterton Society? Like you're saying, keeping him alive?
In the States, there's a G.K. Chesterton Society that I belong to. Did you ever watch WTN? Dale Elquist,
No, I
Yes.
haven't. Sorry.
he has a weekly program on Chesterton. Anybody seen that program? WTN? Yeah, so it's worth watching. So it's growing. It's a growing society, and John Gay mentioned that you need to start some Chesterton societies. We had one in Ottawa, huh, John,
Ronald.
years ago.
What's his name? Ronald.
John said there was one in Toronto, but it's not very active.
Ian Boyd was a great writer.
Oh yes, well he's the editor of the Chesterton Review.
Yeah, you know.
So he's a great Canadian Chestertonian, probably one of the greatest.
He's my cousin.
Pardon?
He's my sister.
Oh, bravo.
Okay. So he's one of the great Chestertonians of the world, you know, Ian Boyd. But unfortunately, Canada doesn't have a great interest in Chesterton. I don't know why. Yes?
C.S. Lewis went around the RAF before World War II, during the Battle of Britain.
Is there anything comparable with G.K. Chesterton, World War I, working in the strengthening of morale and that sort of thing?
I'm not exactly sure what to say. He foresaw the Second World War years before anybody else about Hitler, and came out very strongly. And he was very, very much protective of the Jewish people too. So they see him as one of their heroes as well. But he foresaw Hitler years before the war started. And he called the First World War at the end an armistice. That it couldn't last the way it was. It wasn't a peace. And there's a collection of writings called The End of the Armistice, which is the Second World War. That it was, the Versailles Treaty, etc., was no solution to what was going on. And one of his geniuses is that he loved to be a journalist, not to write a Summa Theologica that would last forever, but he wanted to be involved in daily events. And because he was so insightful, these became immortal works, in my opinion. Like his books, someone asked him, what's your best book? He said, I don't have any best books. He was just right involved in the events of the day, but with a great faith vision. So his works are still worth reading. You have to change some of the details, but the vision that he had of faith in society I think is unparalleled. He's really a great man of great faith. So I hope you can become more interested in his writings. People ask me, well, what should I read? Well, it depends. Do you like poetry? Do you like Lives of the Saints? Do you like theology? It depends what you like. If you like Lives of the Saints, read St. Francis of Assisi. If you're into the intellectual world, read his book on Thomas Aquinas, which scholars say is one of the best books ever written on Thomas Aquinas. They called it the Dumb Ox. He has that wonderful scene that Thomas is at a main table with the king or somebody, and all of a sudden he bangs his fist on the table, and the king says, and Aquinas says, and that will take care of the Manichaeans. And the king says, get him a scribe. He was always thinking about something. Take care of the Manichaeans.
Father, what is your favorite book that Chesterton?
I think St. Francis of Assisi. It was the first book after he became a Catholic, and he poured out his Catholic faith in that book. And that's where I get the title of my book on his mysticism, The Tumbler of God. He said St. Francis went through kind of a spiritual somersault, and when he landed on his feet, he saw the whole world differently. And I have a section on some other so-called mystics that they made the same somersault, but they landed on their heads, like Tolstoy and other people. But the Tumbler, St. Francis of Assisi is a marvelous book. He recommends in that book sometimes to stand on your head and see the world differently. You'll see everything kind of hanging from the sky, but everything depends on God. Yes.
Hey, Father Bob. One of the things, I think what you're pointing to is something that's so evident throughout the world, that there's this, and I was shocked to hear what you said about the Anglican rite removing the renunciation of Satan in their baptismal rite. Why do you think it is that there's such a resistance or fear? Like there might be an acknowledgement of generic evil, but the personification of the devil. What's behind?
Well, it's a very difficult truth. Very simply, to believe that there's evil spirits at work in the world. It's something very difficult to swallow. But often there are things that are so enormous. Like I remember reading an editorial by the New York Times about the Holocaust, and one of the closing comments was that there are some things so enormous that there must be some other cause to evil in the world besides human beings. So I think just basically it's a hard truth, and it's better to just wish them away. So yes.
What was the reason behind Chesterton's conversion, and what was he before he was Catholic?
What was your second part of the question?
Was he an atheist?
Yeah, no, he was. I think his family were Unitarian, something very vague. They hardly went to church. But then, because of his wife, who was a very strong Anglican, he became Anglican. But the cause of his conversion was simply his intellectual journey. He has a book called The Catholic Church and Conversion. And if you ever want a really good book of the intellectual journey of someone coming to Catholicism, I would recommend that book. So I think that book would answer your question. He worked through, the bad popes and the Crusades and all the rest of it, and he finally discovered that Catholicism was the true church. And when he became a Catholic, somebody asked him, "Why did you join that thing?" And he said, "I will write a book about the thing." And that's his book about the Catholic Church. It's called The Thing. And again, it's a wonderful book about the truth of Catholicism. He just, like Cardinal Newman, they just came to discover that the truths that the Catholic Church teaches today were present 2nd century and 3rd century and 4th century. Scott Hahn is like that too. They went to the fathers of the church, and it's all there. I asked a friend of mine once why she became a Catholic. She was, I forget, a Mormon or something. She said, "I asked the question, what happened before 1500?" So I think it was his own intellectual journey. He just convinced himself that Catholicism was the true faith, philosophically, theologically, historically. He had a great devotion to Our Lady. And so I think he'll be canonized someday. He was called the defender of the faith, I think, in Pius the 11th or somebody. Yes, Father? Huh?
Yeah, some of his writings, he writes about Jews and Judaism.
I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
In some of his writings, he writes about Jews and Judaism, and even it kind of compares Hitlerism to Judaism, and he says that Hitlerism is a form of Judaism. There's some things that he wrote kind of in the 30s that raise questions.
Yeah.
Obviously in retrospect with what happened in the Second World War. There are some writings of some things that seem to be problematic.
Yeah, that's certainly true. At a conference, a rabbi gave a talk on that question, and he concluded that Chesterton wasn't anti-Semitic, but there are things. Basically, Chesterton believed in a homeland for the Jews, and sometimes that was taken as, we don't want them in our country. But he was what we call a Zionist very early. But there are problematic things. I agree, he is right. But this rabbi was convinced that, and Chesterton had personal Jewish friends, which is a good sign as well. And he wrote so much that, anybody who wants to have a case for or against almost anything in his life, they could find it. Because they still haven't collected all his writings. They're still discovering things that they've never seen before. And he's one of my mentors, and I hope it becomes more part of your own Catholic journey.
Well,
take two last questions, then you and I think.
Okay.
One was just a comment. I'm interested in Chesterton, but I haven't read a lot of his. I bought Orthodoxy some years ago and didn't click initially for me. But you mentioned Dale Ahlquist, who's done a lot in promoting Chesterton. I think he's written 3 books on Chesterton. The first was G.K. Chesterton, Apostle of Common Sense. He's got 1 chapter on each of his major books, and lots of great quotes. So I just thought that's a very good introduction to him.
Yeah, he's a good friend of mine too.
Can I just add to that? For those of you who, for whatever reason, don't have much of an opportunity to read, at St. Pat's Basilica, in their wonderful bookstore downstairs, you can get a superb DVD that I think it's a 2 or 3 hour DVD, which is hosted by Dale Ahlquist, where I think it's even entitled G.K. Chesterton, Apostle of Common Sense, and this DVD gives you a kind of summary of all the important insights that G.K. Chesterton had developed throughout his lifetime. So that's, for those of you who are interested in a kind of basic introduction, that's a wonderful tool also.
I would just like to echo Father Wild's suggestion that we consider reviving the Ottawa Chesterton Society, which, as he mentioned, flourished in the 1990s until it perished of its own Chestertonian excesses.
Are you smoking too much or what?
Chastened and enlightened by the experience of the past, we might, if there are sufficient interested parties, revive it. And the first instrument for doing so would be to leave your name and contact information in a book which you will find on the book table, surrounded by marvelous works of literature, including 2 by Father Wilde, both of which are Chestertonian. One, the one he mentioned, The Tumbler of God. But the other one, Catherine's Friends, relates the influence of 6 famous people on Catherine Doherty's life and her influence on them. And one of these 6 is Chesterton. So I would also propose that you give consideration to that book as well.
And may I suggest that everyone give consideration to buying as many books as possible from Justin Press.
Yeah.
Dr. Gay is the publisher of Justin Press, which is the publisher of Father Bob Wild's books, at least some of them. And you have a chance on your way out to purchase the book. Or did you bring any other books, Dr.
Yes.
Gay? Okay, so please do that. And on your way out, you got in without making any kind of donation. I just wondered, because I had trouble finding the donation box. But on your way out, you'll see there's a flyer announcing this event. There's a $20 bill taped into the bottom of this clear box, to give you a hint. And I just want you to know that anything that is collected on our way out will be given exclusively to Father Bob Wild. People who take the vow of poverty usually need some money. So, you can't travel down from Cumbermere on a sleigh, and even if you could, actually you probably can now, but you'd still have to buy and feed the dogs. So please, whatever the Lord places in your heart, say there is the clear box on the outside, because I literally found it a couple of minutes before the event, which is why I was so late in running in. But we're going to thank Father Bob if there are no other questions. Right? The last thing I want to do, there's just 2 short announcements. One relates to certainly the most important activities of the Sheptytsky Institute during Lent, which is our liturgical services. If you're ever in the area, please drop by the Sheptytsky Institute chapel for our liturgical services. We have them throughout the academic year. I've got a schedule here. If you're interested in picking one up. The other thing is, speaking of the Chestertonians and other people who really use their brains and not just their emotions, this Friday evening, none other than the great Rusty Reno. R.R. Reno will be exactly at this spot here, delivering a lecture that is the Weston Lecture. It's sponsored by Augustine College. It's an annual event. How many of you have never heard of Rusty Reno? All right. Okay, well, that's okay. Ego to absolvo. Rusty Reno is the editor of First Things. You've all heard of First Things, right? Okay. So he's a brilliant theologian. I know. You just the name didn't. You all thought the name was Reno, right? I know that. So anyway, he's presenting a really important lecture. It's entitled. It's got the phrase "critical thinking." I think it's against critical thinking. It's brilliant. Every third grader now is a master of critical thinking. So they're constantly rejecting everything that you tell them. We now have 2 generations of people whose fundamental approach to epistemology is oppositional defiance disorder. And so no matter what you present them from the perspective of faith, they're using their quote-unquote critical thinking in order to engage you. But they actually don't engage you at all. They really don't think. Per se, they just reject. Sorry, I'm a little polemic here. He will be presenting what I've said to you just now on a much, much higher level. So I really encourage you. And if you have teenagers, university friends that are constantly arguing with you about abortion, same-sex marriage, you name it, bring them on. Bring them here. It'll be a very, very enlightening evening. And speaking of enlightening evenings, Father, Father, he told me I'm not allowed to tell anybody what he's dealing with in terms of a health issue right now. It's something that shall pass, but it's a very, very annoying condition. And in spite of that, not only did he come down this evening, but did just absolutely, as always, a marvelous job. Father, God bless you. Thank you so much. One more.
Father mentioned that Catherine met Sheptynsky. She was in Europe interviewing people for magazines, and she worked for a lecture bureau. So she met Chesterton in London, and he said, "Come, I'll take you out for some good ale." And she said, "I don't like ale." And he said, "You will like this." So they went out to a pub and had a really good meal and cheese and English, sausage, and she really enjoyed it. But he wasn't able to come to the States at that time. But she liked him very much, and I'm sure she read all his Father Brown stories. And anyways, she met the big man.
Great. And we like you very much, Father.